This is sort of a presentation from a practitioner's point of view, and I guess I started my career as a planner in local government, so at council. Then I worked in a women-led social planning consultancy where we advised government a lot on open space strategies and community infrastructure. And then I got asked if I wanted to advise the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, and then became Minister for Cities, Infrastructure and Active Transport. Work in his office and advise him on policy. So I've got quite an interesting perspective, and from that sort of like 8 years of working, still quite early career, I've got a theory that there are 3 essential ingredients of what makes an equitable public space, and I put in brackets that includes women and girls, because a lot of the time when I've spoken to councils about, oh, you know, have you thought about gender equality in our parks? And they're like, yeah, our parks are equal. They've got, a swing for a person in a wheelchair. I'm like, yeah, but what about girls? And they're like, no, but we need to design for everyone, not just girls. So it's actually important when we're talking about equity, like being conscious. I guess it's kind of like positive discrimination in a way, thinking about something from one person's perspective as well as everyone's, if that makes sense. So my 3 essential ingredients, and there are definitely others, but one, you need good, meaningful engagement, and we've spoken a lot about how you can do this and what it looks like so far. But I guess fundamentally, like, you need to ask women and girls what they need rather than assume. And when I say that as well, it's anyone who identifies, and it's also diverse types of women and girls. We're not all the same. Second, you need investment, and I think from the top and bottom, and this is in the form of money, but also time. People are going to have to put a lot of time and money into this. And then 3, I think there's this idea of empathy and being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and kind of think about what that would look like, whether you're a politician or a landscape designer or a planning policy person, thinking about that. So just briefly, like context, this is Australia. We have federal government, then we have state government. So I was working in the New South Wales context where Sydney is, and we also have local government. So we have that little extra level, and I would say the New South Wales government probably does a lot of the funding schools, health, blah, blah, blah. So if that helps. And then it's 128 councils in New South Wales, and then this is Sydney. The other thing to note is this is a colonial map. Obviously, working in the Australian context, there's 60,000 years of continuous Aboriginal culture. So thinking about that dimension, which we've started to do more in the planning context now, but there's a lot more work to do. But the other thing, if you think about socio-economic context, Sydney is pretty much divided in half. It goes this way. Obviously, people with more wealth are near the water, high levels of amenity, things like that, or people up here are near like really beautiful bushland. And then here, there's just been a lot of sort of urbanisation, suburbanation, a lot of migrants, people who are commuting into the city to clean or go to university, whatever, but it takes a long time. And I started my career here, which is Fairfield, which is one of the most multicultural councils in Australia and the most socio-economic diverse council as well. So there's a little bit of context. Why is it important to consider perspectives of women and girls? Sadly, these are some statistics from a Plan International study on Sydney that happened in 2018, and a lot of the statistics are very similar with what we saw yesterday. So in that sense, I think Anna said it this morning, there's a lot of, similar stats that we see again and again over probably decades that aren't changing. And I picked out these 3 quotes because they kind of highlight the way that women's autonomy is sacrificed by fear of safety. So the first one is she has to pay more to move around the city than men. The second one is it actually has to inconvenience herself and walk a longer route to get home because the shortest way doesn't feel safe at night. And then the third, she has to change the way that she looks and what she wears to feel a little bit safer, but she's still obviously not feeling safe. So what's the recipe for change? Talk about this. What does good, meaningful engagement look like? We all, I come from a planning background, and like town hall meetings are a very common method of ticker box engagement. But we probably, if you look at the room, and this is just random pictures of Google, one's from America and one's from the UK, I think. They're quite similar in age, maybe lacking a little bit of diversity. So we probably need less typical town halls and more of the methods that we've all been talking about. And I think storytelling is something really important. Like, I think it's interesting because when you talk about legislation, it is a form of ticker box thing. It's trying to condense something down to a standard, which is usually has to be numerically measured, right? Then how do people's stories like go into something like that? So I'm going to quickly run through some things that I've done. So the photo voice, go along, workshops and co-design, which we've all heard about. So in terms of workshops, we ran, this was in partnership with a local council in Western Sydney, and these are just screen grabs because we made what were called audiograms. So they're random screen grabs, and the things that you see here are just like quick excerpts of quotes of what people think, but you can also listen to it, which is here. And I think that was kind of interesting because I think it would have been intimidating if we were videoing the women through the walk, but the audio is really interesting because you get to hear what it sounds like, and there's a sort of different experience. And obviously everyone talks about big lighting, but having sound is also another interesting dimension, I think. But yeah, like when you look at the quotes, there's nothing that different. So here we're talking about lighting. In the middle, we were talking about why it's important to consider women's perspective, and they were talking about, you know, we want the freedom to be able to walk home from the train station and feel safe. And then the last, third one here, I asked the question, oh, what do you think this space would feel like for if, you know, your husband was here or your son or whatever? And they're like, oh, they wouldn't even think about all this stuff. Like, they have freedom to go anywhere and they don't have to worry about anything. So that was interesting. So this is kind of a group of women. We reached out to them through kind of service providers work in the community and had about 15 on the walk, and it was a night walk as well. This method's the go-along interview. It was part of a piece of research that we did that was looking at barriers of like participating in active transport for women, because obviously we need to shift to climate neutral or positive forms of transport, but are there extra barriers for women when we're doing kind of active transport policies? And as this, we did 20 go-along interviews, and we purposely tried to make it as a diverse cross-section as possible. So we had people who had recently migrated, people with vision impairment, all types of women, but actually I was reflecting on it yesterday, we didn't have any trans women or non-binary women, but, you know, room for improvement. But I think the benefit of the go-along interviews, you're literally like travelling with them on their journey. So I was with Muhadissa, who's an Afghani refugee, for like over an hour, and we're just chatting about her experience and stories and things like that. And I think the other really amazing thing about this is not only did we learn a lot and present it in a story format, but we're talking about how growing up it was illegal for her to ride a bike in Afghanistan. And then it was only after we had this chat and talk and we became friends and stuff, a couple of months later she sent me a photo of her where she bought her first bike. So there's this interesting thing around, can you also use engagement as a form of making micro change? It's like if you're empowering people to look at their space from a different perspective, or get a bike or study planning or whatever, I think that's really interesting. It's not smashing the patriarchy, but it's definitely changing someone's life. This is photo voice, so kind of similar with the Instagram use. Pretty much these are two women, both from refugee backgrounds, but this was someone who had really recently arrived and was an Iraqi refugee, and this is someone who'd been living in Australia for 40 years as a Vietnamese refugee. She was in her 50s. Could still barely speak English, so this was a really useful format we found for people who struggle expressing themselves through language. We did sit afterwards with translators and like, why did you take these photos? But the thing that I love for this person, you can clearly see that her dog is her entry into her community, and it's like so important for social interaction. And here she's like, yeah, I get to meet all sorts of people because my dog, you know, like interacts with people. So that was like really interesting, just looking. And also here, this is a sculpture that kind of tells the story of Vietnamese refugees, which is a big history in Australia. And I think that was really important to her to see herself and her story reflected in public space. And then this I found really interesting because she's newly arrived in Australia and there's so much water and beaches in the Opera House and bush trails. And then she also took photos. She loved the representation of an Aboriginal woman on a building. So there's a lot kind of there when you unpack it, and you know, pictures say 1,000 words, that's the cliche, but I found especially when engaging with people from migrant backgrounds, this was effective and things like that. And obviously co-design, this is an image, I'll talk about it a bit more, but Transport for New South Wales got $30 million to do a Safer Cities program, except it was designed with really strict criteria. So essentially, part of the $30 million, $10 million went to 10 councils, so one each. And then some of it went to state-owned parks. So this was a co-design for Parramatta Park, which is like in the middle of metropolitan Sydney. But yeah, essentially the funding required that you had to do co-design methods. We had to measure the park and its perceptions of safety before, and we will after. We're only at the beginning stages, unfortunately. I can't tell you what a dream park looks like yet in Australia, but part of it, this is kind of part of getting there. So the second one is investment, and I kind of mentioned yesterday, in Australia we had a bit of a political crisis, which was after COVID. There was a federal election last year, and there was a sort of mass movement of women away from the Conservative Party. We had a Conservative Party in New South Wales. They were like, what the hell? Like, what are we going to do to attract women's votes? So, had our state budget, and for the first time, there was a women's opportunity statement, and $16.5 billion was funded over the next 10 years, which is, it's great, but our infrastructure budget's $179 billion. So there's still some inequities, but it's better than nothing and starting from somewhere. So we had $16.5 billion, $108 million for supporting respect in women's financial security, and of this, $30 million over the next 2 years for a Safer Cities program, which was trialling place-based approaches to improve women's perception of safety in public spaces and transport hubs. And this was literally just because I was a political staffer at the time. I have a background in this sort of research, and I was like, you know, like to my boss, I think we should do this. He was like, yep. And then to the Treasurer's office, I'm like, can we have money to do this? They're like, what's the money for? And I'm like, well, I don't actually know yet, but the money is to ask women what they need and then have enough money to fund some of the stuff that they want to see. So that was sort of really interesting, and I think it disrupted. It was really difficult to write the political media release because it's like, $30 million for what? And it was so interesting, even though I didn't write it in the release and the speaking notes and whatever, when they got in front of the camera, they're like, this is for lighting and CCTV. And it's not, but it was just interesting that like, that was the default. It's kind of fascinating when you think about it.
Estelle, got a couple of minutes.
A couple, too? I'm finishing up. But yeah, that's the thing. You can diagnose a problem, and like we've said, there's a lot of research. We know what the issues are, but if there's no funding, are we wasting people's time? Like, what are the ethics of that? That's really sort of interesting in itself. But I guess you don't need $30 million or £15 million either. I think there's probably different scales of interventions we can do at different costs. And the third thing is this empathy from decision makers. So I'll just do a quick lighting sort of story, because you know we all talk about lighting, and if we had a poll about who thinks lighting is important, I think a lot of people would say well, this room's probably a little bit more nuanced, but anyway, I was working in council as like a fresh planner, and I spoke to the parks manager and I said, like, why are all the parks dark at night? Because like when people get home it's dark, so they can't actually exercise. And he said, our parks go to sleep at night like we do. And then it's like, who is the we? And obviously you can kind of picture who this guy was, like just a typical Aussie dude who works in parks management. And it's just really interesting because I had this experience where it was like 10 p.m. on a weeknight. I'd finished a community consultation workshop and I was in like a park in a CBD, and there were all of these Muslim women using the exercise equipment at that time with their, like, trying to see with their torches on their phone. I was like, what's going on? And so I was like, what are you doing? Like, and what's going on here? And they were just kind of like, this is the only time we get for us. Like, our kids are asleep, our husbands are at home with them, so it's fine. They live in apartments and, you know, can't really afford that much air conditioning. This is the only time that they got to exercise when it was cooler. So obviously our summers are quite warm. So there is like this thing where it's like, well, you know, who is the we? And I think it's so interesting preparing for this presentation. I've got like the Google photos, and you can type, you know, parks at night, and it came up with photos I'd taken, and I was like, what the hell? We actually do light our parks at night in Sydney, but they're basketball court and a skate park. Obviously a bunch of guys using it. Oh, these are tennis courts. And then skate park. This park's called Sydney Park. That's the only bit of the park that's lit, pretty much, and the park. And then this is like the football stadium. So it's like the two spaces that are lit are actually spaces that boys are far more likely to be using. So again, like, think about when you say statements like this, what does it actually mean, and then unpack that. So that's it. Thank you.
Great, Estelle. Thank you very much.